Okay, so I'm just going to give 3 types of example then of the sort of implications, not just for pragmatics, but for theories of communication that we might get from at least bringing considerations of epistemic vigilance into the work we do on communication, recognizing that it's a separate process, but it does have effects on communication and comprehension. There are references to a couple of forthcoming articles of mine, one where I talk about evidentials and discourse connectives, and one where I talk about irony. So let's think about evidentials. And here I'm just simply going to lay out a couple of alternative hypotheses, and then the task is to assess them. Evidentials, the standard claim about them is that they're present in 25% of the world's languages. They're fully grammaticalized, they're not lexical items, they're part of the grammatical system. And an awful lot of work has been done recently on assessing their development. And the answer is that children master evidentials much faster than they master the corresponding lexicalized expressions in English, German, and so on. So there's something special about them. I'm not going to talk too much about that. But anyway, what evidentials are for is indicating the type of evidence the speaker has for her assertion. And if you had a language sort of with lots of evidentials, it would be able to distinguish visual evidence from non-visual but directly perceived evidence, evidence inferred from perceptual clues, evidence assumed on the basis of background knowledge, and evidence from reported speech. So different markers for each of these types of evidence. And you think 25% of the world's languages, that's an awful lot. What's the function of these evidentials? And there are sort of 2 possible hypotheses about them. One is a sort of Gricean hypothesis in 12. They're used cooperatively. They're used to help the hearer by indicating the type of evidence that the speaker has. The cooperative, that's their function, to help the hearer understand what the speaker is claiming. The alternative suggestion, which we've been pursuing a little bit, is that no, they emerge into language as a means for the speaker to advertise her accuracy, reliability, and honesty. And by doing this, to appear reliable and so to get past the hearer's epistemic vigilance mechanisms. If you can manage to appear reliable, you get the hearer to believe because he'll trust you. Now, the only evidence I've got for that idea so far is sort of anecdotal from reading what people who speak these languages say about evidentials. And they all fit with the non-Gricean hypothesis, the epistemic vigilance hypothesis. I got some quotes here from this very nice book by Alexandra Eichenwald. She says, or she doesn't say it, she's got quotes from speakers of these languages saying it. Ignoring evidentiality in a language with evidentials gets you marked as unreliable or a liar. In other words, it's to do with the speaker's honesty. Second, accuracy in getting one's information source right is crucial for successful communication and for the speaker's reputation. So the idea is that these things emerged as ways for the speaker to acquire a reputation for being accurate and honest and therefore be trusted by hearers. Okay, similarly, 2 hypotheses about discourse connectives. Actually, yeah, I'll just give 2 hypotheses. First, logical connectives, the truth functional ones like and, not, or, and then the non-truth conditional ones like the discourse connectives like but, nevertheless, and also. Now, Diane Blakemore famously within relevance theory has defended the view in 13a that discourse connectives, again, it's a very Gricean view, the discourse connectives are used to help the hearer understand. You use but to indicate to the hearer what inferences you want him to draw. So they play a role directly in pragmatics. But Oswald Ducrot way back, and since then Dan Sperber, has suggested, no, actually, they're not to help the hearer understand, they're to help the speaker persuade. So again, it's to do with the speaker's role in persuading, laying out arguments to convince hearers. If you can set out a logical argument, you'll make your content believable quite independently of the source. And so the idea is that that's what happened. Speakers began using discourse connectives to convince hearers, and hearers used reasoning then to defend themselves. So there's a quote from Dan Sperber: displaying logical or evidential relations requires an argumentative form, the use of logical terms such as if, and, or, and unless, and of words indicating inferential relationships such as therefore, since, but, and nevertheless. It's generally taken for granted that the logical and inferential vocabulary is and presumably emerged as a tool for reflection and reasoning. It's again undermining that view. From an evolutionary point of view, this is not particularly plausible. The hypothesis that such terms emerged as tools for persuasion may be easier to defend. So again, there's a whole line of argument that, as it were, shifts the emphasis from pragmatics, from helping the hearer to understand, to the use of language to get beyond the hearer's epistemic vigilance processes. And it would be nice to see how that debate will come out. And I'll end by mentioning just one more that, you know, I'm particularly interested in, and that's verbal irony. I mean, I've been thinking about this for years, and I don't think I've still got it quite right. But I have a forthcoming article where I present this view. It's been forthcoming for a very long time, but I think it's in the UCL working papers already. And here are two hypotheses then about verbal irony. The Gricean hypothesis, 14a, it involves blatant violation of a pragmatic maxim to convey an implicature. So irony is a purely pragmatic matter. You violate the maxim of truthfulness in order to convey a related implicature. And the hypothesis which I'm defending is, no, on the Gricean account, it's sort of presupposed that the utterance is false or epistemically unsound. And that's the starting point for comprehension. And I'm arguing instead, no, what irony does, it conveys this, it communicates that the utterance is false or epistemically unsound and conveys the speaker's attitude of mockery or ridicule to that fact. So again, it's shifting the emphasis from a pragmatic account of irony to an account that relies on epistemic vigilance. And here I think there is some evidence, because it's been well known for a very long time that children start being able to understand irony at exactly, roughly the same time that they start being able to cope with deception, roughly the time that they can pass second-order false belief tests, sort of 4, 5, 6, 7, that sort of age. Now, the Gricean account doesn't really explain why those two things come online together. But if you look at the epistemic vigilance account, then you see that deception and irony are very closely parallel. So there are parallels in the ability to cope with deception. What's deception? It's intended to make the hearer believe something that the speaker regards as false or epistemically unsound. Versus irony, which is intended to make the hearer recognize that the speaker regards something as false or epistemically unsound. So the idea is, if you take this slightly different view of irony, you get a better view of the relations between irony and deception. And so that's all fairly programmatic, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really intriguing, stimulating talk, and I think that we have time for questions. Yes, please.
First, thanks a lot for a really very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed everything.
Thank you.
I just have, let's say, two, I don't know, comments or observations, and I would like to see, you know, how you can relate to them. One, which is really bothering, like the effectiveness of propaganda, right? And it looks like, you know, if something sounds familiar, it is true. It's not just beauty is truth, and truth is beauty, is familiarity is beauty, or truth, and so on. So how do you relate to that?
Shall I answer them shall I respond to that first and then come back to you?
And maybe just attached to this is the fact that, you know, like in Israel and everywhere else in the world, we know our leaders, lie to us all the time, and nonetheless, we are sort of, it takes us a long time to actually deprive them of power. So we keep voting for them. How come we do that? If we are reasonable and...
Yeah. I think that's a very good question. The last section of our article, which I didn't talk about because it's really very far from anything I've been involved with, this other stuff I have worked on, but the last part of the article is on epistemic vigilance on a population scale. So the argument, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but it sort of goes like this. Our epistemic vigilance processes evolved to protect us in face-to-face interaction. As soon as things start getting repeated on a population scale, there's a danger that our epistemic vigilance processes break down, precisely in the cases you suggest. What they've looked at more is they looked at the spreading of reputation, where again the same thing happens. If lots of different people repeat the same thing, even if it's not based on independent evidence, you tend to believe it more. And the line they're sort of taking is, that's just our vigilance processes are failing. And the other type of thing they've looked at is religious beliefs, where you actually don't understand what's being said to you, but you really trust you begin learning religion when you're young, and you trust everyone who tells you this, and so you just you believe it and assume that the proper interpretation of it is true. Now, the political case is a third case, which is really worth looking at too, and I think they would probably take the same line. So you're quite that's a very good question, and the argument seems to go either there's a lot of sort of unjustified reliance on the word of public figures, or it's this repetition effect, and the problem is that our vigilance processes break down on a population level. So thank you. Yeah.
And the second question, well, I'll be short, okay? There is also probably a difference between knowing and believing. Like, for instance, I know that the sun doesn't rise in the east, or that it doesn't rise at all, but I live, according to the belief that it does. So,
yeah. That's right, and I haven't sort of taken this across to knowledge, because knowledge really isn't a psychological notion, it's a metaphysical notion, because it doesn't involve just what goes on in your head, it involves the relation between what goes on in your head and what goes on out there. But you're right, and I think the interesting thing there is that it's like visual illusions. You know that those two lines are the same length, but they really don't look it. So your automatic inferences are somehow trumping your background knowledge, something like that.
Okay.